and we're this week 3 of our series today. We're going to be taking a closer look at justice. In the Old Testament, there's a lot of scriptures that talk about God being upset because the people of God forgot God, and they forgot about justice. So we're going to look at 3 of many scriptures that are out there where God is just wondering, how did my people forget me? Deuteronomy 32:18, you deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. Jeremiah 2:32, does a maiden forget her jewelry, a bride her wedding ornaments? Yet my people have forgotten me, days without number. Ezekiel 22:12, and you men accept bribes to shed blood and take usury and excessive interest and make unjust gain from your neighbors by extortion. And you have forgotten me, declares the sovereign Lord. So even today we forget about things, don't we? In this past series that we just got done with, Pause, we talked about how sometimes God might feel distant or silent or far away from us, but the reality is God is still present. We have just forgotten about God. But what happens to God's love when it's out of sight? Does it still exist? Just because we can't see it at a certain moment in time, is it still there? Well, of course it's there. If we don't feel or see God, God's love is still present. It's the same thing with oppression and injustice that we're talking about with this series. If we think about, well, I've never actually seen an orphan in Africa. I've never actually been around the world or been to a third world country to see the injustice. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not there. Or a problem that exists in the United States, homelessness. That's something that people experience every day and even in our own community. But even if we don't interact with it on a daily basis, that doesn't mean other people don't deal with that on a daily basis. Or something maybe a little more close to home, a form of oppression is bullying. That's where people are feeling and being oppressed, bullying. That's happening in our own schools. But even if you have never seen it or experienced it or watched someone else go through it, that doesn't mean other people haven't seen it or experienced it. In 1985, which, how many of you were not born in 1985? That's most of the room. I was actually only 2, so I kind of just made that one. In 1985, Live Aid concert raised $200 million for food relief in Africa. And this is a picture of that show, and you can tell the styles have changed just a little bit. But that was in 1985. And so Bono, who's a lead singer, who's familiar with Bono or familiar with U2? You've heard that band before. Bono participated in this concert in U2. And shortly after this concert and raising this money, Bono and his wife, Ali, traveled to Ethiopia. And they witnessed and saw how quickly that $200 million was depleted. Not because it was misused, but because of how great that need is and how far that money went, but it was used up very quickly. So several years later, down the road, Bono is quoted as saying in an interview, we promised that we would never forget what we had been through. But of course, we did. How many of you can relate to that? How many times have you been on a mission trip or a retreat and you've seen something, you've experienced something, you've tasted God, you've seen poverty and thought, I want to do something about this. I want to change. I want to help people here, people back home. That's so easy to happen. It's so easy for us to forget even good intentions. Somehow that happens. Edmund Burke, who lived in 18th century England, said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Because the oppressors, people who are doing the act of oppressing, are counting on our silence. They're counting on people who are not going to stand up. They're counting on people who are going to be apathetic and not do anything. So listen to this confession from a German pastor, Martin Niemöller, taking a guess there, in the 1940s, said this. In Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, but I didn't speak up because I was Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up. And I bet every one of us in this room has seen or witnessed or experienced some form of oppression, whether it's to us or we saw experience to someone else, and we failed to do something. We failed to step up. So a lot of times we don't know kind of what to do. So a lot of times we remain silent. But a lot of times we don't always speak up. So I'm going to look at a passage, and we're going to kind of walk through this one and take a couple breaks as we go through it. It's Isaiah 58, and we're just going to start off with reading verses 1 through 5, and it'll be up on the screen as well. But I want you to listen to what God has to say about fasting as you hear these slides or hear these scriptures. Shout it aloud. Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For the day they seek me out, they seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions, and they seem eager for God to come near to them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fasting I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? So these are the first 5 verses. Can I ask somebody who doesn't mind writing on the board? Do you want to, Amanda? Okay. Last week, when I was writing on the board, it was really tricky words and names, and we're not doing that this time, so it won't be nearly as hard. So when I tell you, you can write, but not quite yet. Awesome. So in this, I asked you all to listen up for fasting. And does anybody know what fasting is? Yeah. Not eating. Okay. Anybody else have another response? Yeah. Okay, so kind of like when there's a ritual, there's a pattern to that fast. Fasting means to cover the mouth. So covering above the mouth. And it's a spiritual discipline that many people still do today. But back in biblical times, it was done a lot. It was a very heavy practice of showing your devotion to God. So from these 5 verses, though, what do we hear about from this situation that's in Isaiah? What do we hear that God dislikes about fasting? And if we might have to just kind of go back and forth between the 2 slides to see all of it. What do you guys think? What is God saying God dislikes about fasting? And then go to the next one.
You don't eat food and then you turn around and do bad things.
Okay, so you fast, but then immediately after you do bad things. So anything that they say I'll put on the left column. What else?
Wait, what'd you say?
You can just put they do bad things. So they participate in the fasting, but immediately after they do bad things. Yeah. Okay, pride and self-honor. Like, hey, look at me, I'm fasting. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Kind of taking that pride? Yeah, because he says that, and that's in the couple verses up from this one, where they take a lot of pride in what they're doing. What else? Yeah, you can just shout it out. Yeah, Ashley.
I was saying, like, you can fast, but don't expect things just to be perfect because you fast. You have to work towards perfection, and there is no.
Okay, so it's not just kind of an end-all, okay? It won't just solve all your problems.
Don't expect.
Yeah, you can just put up expectations. That's fine.
Using for their own agenda.
Doing it for their own agenda, okay? Yeah.
They only do it for 1 day at a time. Like, it's not like they're constantly.
Okay, so it's not constantly part of their lives. What else do you see that the scripture up on the screen says? Your fasting ends in what? Verse 4. They're fighting, quarreling, and strife. And somebody mentioned that earlier about they end up doing bad things after they fast. What does it say after that? Verse 4.
They exploit their workers. Verse 3.
Okay, so that's verse 3. That's the second part of the verse 3. Yeah. On the day of your fast, you do as you please, and then you exploit all your workers. Meaning all the people who are out working while they're trying to show devotion to God, they end up exploiting them and taking advantage of them, of their labor. And then it goes on to say, what you do today, you expect your voice to be unheard on high. Is this the kind of fast that I've chosen for you? And this is where it talks about, is it just so that you can humble yourselves? When really they were engaging a lot of pride that somebody said in the back. So these are the kind of the things that this passage is saying why are you fasting and doing it in this way? Because in fasting is in many ways supposed to be shown as this devotion to God. But I wonder what else God might say. We mess up sometimes. What other spiritual practices, like our worship or our prayer, do we often think we're doing it right, but we end up doing it kind of wrong and doing it for the wrong reasons? So I want to read the next 2 verses if you want to put them up and just hang out for a second. So here we read the kind of devotion that God does appreciate, picking up in verse 6. Is not this the kind of fast I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor with shelter? When you see the naked, clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. So kind of comparing the first 5 verses with these next 2, what do we hear about what God does like? Put others before ourselves, okay? What else? Yeah, on that side, on the right-hand side. What else do we see here about what God does want us to do? Help the needy. Awesome. It sounds like a simple answer, but it's right. Help the needy. And what kind of specifically are some of the areas that people have need that God's saying to help with? Clothe the naked. Set the oppressed free. That's up there. What else? Yeah, give somebody without shelter, give them a roof over their heads. Food. Yeah, some of those are very basic, just basic needs that people need. Loose the chains of injustice. So that's any kind of form of injustice that we end up getting bonded to and in bondage to. And God is saying, free those people, help my people out, untie the cords of the yoke. And the yoke is what was connected to the animals that were working the land. And so it's just a further imagery of God saying, free people. Take away that injustice. Okay, you can sit. Thanks so much. And we see just this difference of what the people were doing and how they distorted it and what God was saying, this is what I want to see have happen instead. I'm going to finish out reading this kind of passage of Scripture in Isaiah 58. Picking it with verse 8. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer, and will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. Here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, and with a pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your might will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land, and he will strengthen your frame. And you will be like a well-watered garden and a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the old age foundations. You will be called repairer of the broken walls, restorer of the streets with dwellings. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So we see where these people were trying to engage in spiritual practice, which was fasting, but they were being prideful with it. They were taking it on their own, and they're saying, we're not going to eat, so we're too hungry to do our labor, so we're going to exploit our laborers and have them do it, because we're trying to show devotion to God, very much putting themselves in front of other people. But instead, God's saying, instead of doing that, why don't you help these people? These people are hungry, not because they're trying to show devotion to me, but because they have gone for a long time without food. So it's kind of this difference of how we approach God. Has anyone heard of John Foreman? Or familiar with the band Switchfoot? maybe? Okay, John Foreman used to be the lead singer, still is, of the band Switchfoot, but he came out with his own CD, and we're going to pass out, our volunteers are going to pass out lyrics to a song called Instead of a Show. And these lyrics are based off of a passage in Amos, and we just read from Isaiah, but it's very, very similar language about the things that God seeks for us and wants for us about justice. So you just have the lyrics in hand so that you can follow along fairly well with the song. But I just want you to think about this passage of Isaiah as you hear these words played.